colourblind casting is a phrase from the 1980s that is as relevant today as renting your TV from Granada Television.
When we talk about decolonizing, what we often do is we want to insert a race conversation, but we never gauge that race conversation.
And I'll start by quoting Malcolm X, and he says, if you stick a knife 9 inches into my back and take it out 3 inches, well, that's not progress. Even if you take it all the way out, that's still not progress. Unless you actually heal the wound, we haven't had any progress or any repair.
Which brings us to what decolonization is not. Inclusive and multicultural, but not decolonizing. Why is that? Many of the UK universities are trying to incorporate decolonization into the curricula as a mechanism of inclusion. In the United States, we talk about this as multiculturalism. You're not changing the fundamental structure. I'll take my discipline, for instance. If you start asking the question, what is philosophy? And you start going down, say, the modernists, you're doing Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, etc. And you decide to add a black person. Let's say you do Du Bois, right? What fundamentally changes about the understanding of social contract theory between Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, and then what you put in with Du Bois? Nothing. The idea is that Du Bois somehow wants to be part of this republic, wants to be covered by the social contract, whereas nothing else could be farther from the truth. See, decolonization would then take a turn. It would mean that you have to reconceptualize what social contracts are. Are black people actually safe? And do they have security in white Western republics? That doesn't seem to be the case historically. But if you assume that they simply wanted to be parts of nations and societies that killed them, lynched them, enslaved them, colonized them, then what does that say about the political aspirations and the versions of liberty that black people and other oppressed groups can imagine? Think about that seriously. As a political theorist, we aim to say that normative values, freedom, democracy, liberty, these are innate, emotive, and effective qualities that generate positive philosophy, right? We want the rule of law because we want a society that's free. But can you apply that same standard to people who have been enslaved? Charles Mills says the difference between black philosophy and most Euro-American and European philosophies is that black people have always had to deal with the problem of subhumanity, of not being persons. So the struggle that's embedded within their philosophical discourse from the 19th century forward is on the basis of constantly fighting against oppressive structures, oppressive institutions and entities that want to manifest their inhumanity and subpersonhood as the basis of Western democracy. So diversifying the curricula with different figures that talk about the civil rights movement, that may talk about black abolitionism, that may even look at the symbolism of Obama being the first black president to preside over a white republic, doesn't fundamentally change the structures or the apparatus of how we know. These figures are claimed to want us to assimilate into white supremacist societies. They don't teach you King, they teach you Martin Luther King in UK universities through his letter from Birmingham jail. They don't teach you King from Where Do We Go From Here, where he argues that we need a revolution of values, that it will be only through God's grace that white people can be saved from themselves because of the evilness they've created in racism and imperialism. See, that sounds radical, but that's the Martin Luther King that the black community in America know. Because when we look at King as a symbol of civil rights motivation and heroism, it's not because he wanted to integrate us with our oppressors. It's because he stood fast, though non-violently, against what that oppression is, because he understood that the concept of humanity and of democracy that could see black people hate themselves, that could give you images and support segregation, that had black people live below every other group of people in the country simply because of the color of their skin, was not a society or a concept of democracy that black people themselves could live with. See, that's the King that fits within the decolonial tradition. That's the King that is supporting decolonial and anti-colonial movements all throughout the world, and specifically in Latin America. That's the King that wants to eliminate the military-industrial complex. But these are not the versions of black people and black thought that we're often given. We're given stories and narratives that suggest that the ultimate prize of black liberation is the integration into the societies of our oppression, not the fundamental refutation of the ideas that built the social organization that led to black oppression in the first place.
We just have to look at the kind of mathematics produced in the Egyptian, Babylonian, Indian, and Chinese civilizations, where they had developed mathematics to much higher orders than Europe till in the mid millennia of the last millennia. So till 15th, 16th century, you still had very important contributions in mathematics, including material from algebra, indeterminate equations, and the first examples of proto-calculus and so on, coming from Indian mathematical traditions. And if you look at, I'm giving an example of Indian mathematics here, if you look at this, you see that it is fundamentally different than the way mathematics is understood in Western culture. Indian mathematics is empirical, not formal. The very famous example is of how the metaphysics of square root of 2, which is so influential for the Pythagorean tradition, does not happen in Indian traditions, just like the metaphysics of negative numbers. There is no Platonism, and most importantly, there is no link to theology. The constant association of mathematics, mathematical knowledge with the ideas of theology, which is very much present from Plato onwards in the Western tradition, is not available in these other mathematical traditions. And another very important example is that of medicine, which is something which is a living tradition today. You have powerful cultures of knowledge of healing, which including in Indian practice today is still used by millions of people. And I don't have time to talk about the examples here, but you can see how people respond to the COVID cases in India by drawing upon many of these medical systems. But for Western knowledge system, including the way in which medicine is taught in India, in medical schools, all these traditions are called as, they're seen as not being scientific, and so they are not taught to their students. So this is part of the problem of the colonization, which has become part of our modern knowledge systems. And most importantly, when we talk of decolonizing science, science is much more than just knowledge. Because you open today a book, some of the most important books on, let's say, history of mathematics, for example, will just have a footnote on the kind of mathematics done in earlier civilizations. They may talk about some very ancient Egyptian stuff about mathematics, but some of the most important work done on mathematics in other cultural contexts are never even mentioned as part of the history of mathematics. So there is a creation of the idea of mathematics which keeps aside certain kinds of developments of mathematics in other cultures.
So I'll start with a scientific figure who is very influential in my research, Albert Einstein. He was the person who came up with the theory of general relativity, which is the most well-accepted theory of gravity that is known, and that's something that I use extensively in my own work. So one of the things Einstein did when he was confronted with Bohr's theory of the quantum atom was that he was horrified. In fact, he was so horrified that he refused to accept it, and he told Bohr quite famously that God doesn't play dice. Now, quantum mechanics is a paradigm shift in our understanding of the world. We go from determinism to looking at probabilities as being the fundamental form on which our world is based. Einstein was a theist. He believed in an immutable God, an object that was eternal. He was not able to understand this probabilistic interpretation of nature. He was not able to accept it. When he created general relativity, one of the solutions to his own equations predicted that the universe would be expanding in an accelerated way. That is ultimately what the observations tell us about our universe today. But Einstein was unable to accept this fact because he was obsessed with this idea of the eternal. So he came up with this with this contrived term called the cosmological constant, denoted by a capital lambda, which he put by hand into his equations to try to make his equations give us a static universe. Because Einstein was very clever, this actually worked out in his favor after his death, because this is the simplest model we have of something called dark energy, which purportedly is supposed to be responsible for the expansion of the universe. We don't really know what it is. It's 70% of the entire universe. Do you see what I mean about asking scientists to be humble? We don't know what 70% of what we're made up of actually is. But let me talk about Einstein, the man himself. When he moved to the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, he was an outspoken advocate for anti-racist beliefs and ideologies in the US. So one of the things he commented on American racism was he called it the nation's worst disease. Yet recently, some papers were found, or letters he had written on his own travels when he traveled to China, where he called Chinese people industrial, filthy, and obtuse. So this is not my effort to try to sully Einstein's character, but just my effort to show you that making heroes of people, institutions, or concepts is a very dangerous practice. And also to show you that a scientist, no matter how brilliant and how famous and how much their contribution has been to the field that they are working in, they are not without cultural context. Had Einstein not been a theist, would he have accepted quantum mechanics earlier? Would we have had a theory of quantum gravity? I don't know.
Clarence Thomas was a person who owes his appointment and confirmation to an intersectional failure. And this is where we come to the story about Anita Hill. So Clarence Thomas was a person who was nominated by the first Bush. There were many African Americans and liberals who initially opposed him, heeding Thurgood Marshall. He was the first African Americans, warning that having a black person on the Supreme Court was no guarantee that they would lift up civil rights. And so consequently, many opposed Clarence Thomas, looking for someone with a deeper background in supporting, advocating civil rights expansion and ensuring that the existing hard-fought rights were going to be upheld by the Supreme Court. However, at a crucial moment, Anita Hill was flown to Washington, D.C. by the Senate Judiciary Committee to testify about her experiences when she was working with Clarence Thomas in previous positions. When she told her testimony, Clarence Thomas denounced the testimony and the hearing as a high-tech lynching that was reserved for uppity Negroes who deemed it important to think for themselves. Now, many saw this as a decisive race claim that demanded solidarity across the racial terrain for any people who saw themselves as part of the racial justice coalition. Now, despite the fact that there's no recorded history of anyone ever being lynched for anything that was done to a black woman, it still worked partly because lynching tells a story about the American experience of white supremacy that focuses on the sexual repression and punishment of African American men. When he was able to say that, the fact that she was herself a black woman, the fact that this has never been the response to abuse of black women, just was utterly irrelevant. And as a consequence, millions of people moved to Clarence Thomas's side and began to advocate to their senators the need to confirm him as against this effort, this racist effort to keep him off of the court. I have to say, having been there at the hearing and seeing him say that, I almost fell out of my chair. Clarence Thomas was never known as an advocate for racial justice, never known as one who looked back at history to use that to think about what was happening in a contemporary. This was just a one-off moment to wrap himself in, the tragedy of a particular racial history at a time that it had nothing to do with what was actually happening. Now, part of the reason that was successful is because of the intersectional erasure of the way that racism was experienced by Black women. In particular, an erasure around the fact that sexual harassment itself, sexual harassment law, actually began with African American women suing employers for race and gender discrimination as experienced through harassing behavior. What many people who supported Clarence Thomas often said that suggested how much ignorance there was about that story was that sexual harassment wasn't something that Black women were concerned with. Sexual harassment was a preoccupation of American white women built off of the history of Puritans when it comes to sexuality. And so it has nothing to do with discrimination and nothing to do with African American women.
So I think this is a complicated question, largely because I come from the United States, where white liberals and white supremacists actually share a great disdain for Black people broadly. So when we talk about groupthink, or the pursuit of an idea that one group has a certain kind of knowledge base or authority on certain matters, in white institutions, that usually leads to the representation of the people white liberals choose, what group they want to advocate on behalf of, has very little to do with truth and more on political interests. So the quest for victimization, the quest for the kinds of identities that cannot be questioned, in many ways acts against the radical traditions that oppressed people have made, explored, and taught for centuries. In the UK, I've been quite surprised because despite the relatively low numbers of people of color, there's still this insistence by white liberals that certain positions should not be heard. And even when those people are absent, be they Black, brown, etc., white liberals can act on behalf of them. Now, this is no different than what we also see on the right. In the United States, for instance, I was censored when I was at Texas A&M precisely because I offended white supremacists. I don't know how you don't offend white supremacists if you're Black, but nonetheless, the accusation by the president was that a Black person or a Black professor offended white supremacists. Now, in that situation, given that the Board of Trustees at Texas A&M were sympathetic to the alt-right, there was a call to censor me, a call to kick me out, a call to make sure that the alt-right and the growing Republican consensus did not discuss race, racism, or white supremacy as a structural apparatus of American society. The effect of that was that years later, you had the same people, a same group of people that had power, claim that they could not be attacked with reason. They suggested rather than debate the merits of critical race theory or white supremacy as a structural apparatus or cultural ideological phenomena, that they'll simply ban the teaching of critical race theory and Black history in universities and courses. So the question of groupthink becomes relatively important for how we think about which groups we're situating. I think what ultimately happens, especially in the UK, is that this becomes bifurcated in a very left and liberal versus conservative and right ideology. But coming from the United States and then being placed in the UK, you can see that there's a muting on both sides. The reactionism that you get from the right is one that doesn't want to engage or look at the colonial histories that have formed the basis of British society. Universities have less than 1% Black people, Black professors are Black and other minorities there, but yet they speak on behalf of them as if their experiences can be translated and transferred to how white liberals see themselves. A bunch of middle-class white people arguing that their right identity politics makes them the most victimized despite their economic and political privilege. And on the behalf of them arguing for people, certain kind of voices are pushed out. And now many people will think that that's actually progress, that we're actually advocating for people who are silenced, who are absent, who need to be represented. But you have to ask yourself a question. Would those people that are not there actually choose the white liberal to be their spokesperson? Would they actually, in fact, prefer that those voices can actually accurately represent them? And in a world where they can't, how many of the white liberals would then silence the Black radicalism or the Black anarchism or the Black socialism or the Afro-pessimism that doesn't align with their political ideology? Would we be so apt to say that British society is fundamentally racist if we take a critical race theory perspective? And if that violates some of the political sensibilities that the left has, what then happens to those people that they said they advocate on behalf of? Do they simply disagree with black people enough to still advocate for them, or do they have to displace those radical voices for more humanist and progressive tones? But this doesn't let the right off the hook either. In this country, I've been quite surprised because this very debate about groupthink, right, this very essence of who should be listened to and who should be silenced, plays out in very, very ugly ways culturally. So whereas the United States is a very racially stratified society, where, you know, if you're black or white, you fit on certain sides of a political spectrum. Here, there's the idea that we can embrace the notion that we're colorblind and we're human beings. And from that perspective, groups that think differently, that are trying to introduce racial difference, sexual difference, etc., seem to be the ones that are ultimately trying to disrupt the culture. So I think the question, again, of group thing becomes one that's very important, but it doesn't become the kind of situation where it's whether or not truth is had or truth is not had. Ultimately, it's a question of who controls power and who allows the people to be heard and represented as having the truthful perspective. And unfortunately, that's led us to a misguided liberalism that prefers colorblindness rather than a rigorous radical tradition or critical intervention of social inequality.
I want to ask Kehinde, I mean, Adjoa's talking about Richard II and the production that she did. What do you think of an argument that if a woman of colour goes to that production, she's not the only woman of colour in the room for once, you know, as Adjoa's been quoted saying? Is that something worth doing?
I mean, like, we have to operate within the constraints that we're in, right? And I remember going to an all-black cast of Julius Caesar and it being really powerful. And this is obviously a positive thing to do, but it's a much bigger problem than that. Why do we center Shakespeare so much? Like, Shakespeare is great, but there's other stuff out there. Why do we center these same stories and same narratives? And if you have to, in order to get some kind of diversity or historical, you have to keep putting black and Asian characters into miscast intent historically, and that's you're telling the wrong stories. There's plenty of stories about Britain that would involve us and that we would be in automatically. And so the bigger thing is, well, how do you tell a different range of stories that better reflect our actual society? But
you do that as well, is the point, Kehinde. You do that as well. So that kids are going to be taught Shakespeare. So let them come and see it. You know, we're in a black box. We're not in, you know, Rome or Denmark. We're in Stratford, in Manchester or whatever. So you have to do them all. That's why this new Netflix thing I'm doing, we have a mixed race Queen Charlotte, because she was mixed race. And we have people of all stratas in that show because there were people of all stratas in that show. I just think we have to try and cover everything, because the downfall of the super state as we know it is not coming anytime soon, and we have to let our children see themselves. You know, the difference between my cousin who went to study medicine in America, who'd grown up in Ghana, and his classmates who were born and raised in America, in terms of how they viewed the possibilities for who they could be in the world, was striking, because everybody in Ghana, from the road sweeper to the president, looked like my cousin. And it wasn't the same experience for those other children in his class at med school. And he was kind of shocked by how truncated their horizons were. So, you know, I think we just have to try and expand that vision as much as we can. But fundamentally, you're right. Unless we have the downfall of this state as we know it, it's all window dressing, and we do what we can.
Actually, objectively, Britain is a great place to live. I'm going to come back to this because that's actually a really important point, right? So if we're thinking about, the problem with this question is that it suggests that these sins are in the past. And actually, these things aren't in the past. Racism is not in the past. It is still very much in the present. And I'll start by quoting Malcolm X. Malcolm's my favorite. You'll hear a lot of Malcolm X quotes from me. And he says, if you stick a knife 9 inches into my back and take it out 3 inches, well, that's not progress. Even if you take it all the way out, that's still not progress. Unless you actually heal the wound, we haven't had any progress or any repair. And if you actually look at and I'll just use black people in the Caribbean as an example, because I've got 3 minutes and it's quite a good example. If you just use that as an example, you would say the knife isn't even out. It's actually still about 6 inches deep, right? So my family, and your family from the Caribbean, brought over there as slaves, right? With nothing, literally had the had exploitation and resources beat out of us, right? Now, we think because slavery finished in 1838, that somehow, well, it's done, it's over. Well, no, what happened at the end of slavery was the biggest government bailout in history to the slave owners, money which you can track today, which is still in the economy, and both of our descendants were left with nothing and had to keep doing work like slaves for nothing, and were deeply impoverished still for the next generation. Jamaica was a colony of Britain for a whole generation. Jamaica is still basically a colony of Britain if we're 100% honest. And so when our parents came over, our grandparents came over to the UK, they came with nothing, right? They came to the mother country expecting to be treated well. And what did they find? Racism. More racism. Couldn't get housing, couldn't get jobs, etc., etc., etc. And the fact that a couple of us, and a few of us have done well, I'm doing very, very well, right? Doesn't change the fact. Let's look at the evidence. The black youth unemployment rate today is exactly the same as it was in 1980. The wealth gap, which is enormous, where does that wealth gap come from? We were bought over as slaves, we had no wealth, and we're poor because of that. Why is Britain a great place to live? Because of the wealth exploited from our backs. So if you look at somewhere like Jamaica, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, you tell me that racism is dead. It's not dead, it's still there, it's not past. That's what reparations is about. Not about apologies or not about individuals. It's about looking at the whole and saying, actually, that gap of wealth is still there. And that racism still affects all of our lives today.